Why do we need a law to treat each other like humans? Why do we need a law to take care of each other? It's our core basic part of our humanity. I think it is the definition of humanity. The reality is there's going to be folks who are breaking that very human contract.
In today's episode, I speak to Emily May, founder, activist, and author. During our conversation, we address topics of a sexual nature that may be disturbing or triggering to some listeners. Listener discretion is advised. Welcome to the World Health Organization's #NoExcuse podcast. I am your host, Guni Dias. Today I'm sitting with founder, activist, and author Emily May. Welcome.
Thank you so much for having me, Guni.
So when we first met, you shared your story on how your mission to end all forms of harassment has started. So when, unfortunately, after you had experienced street harassment, you noticed that many others around you had similar experiences. And you, unlike most people who just conclude, I'm just going to accept this as part of life, you make it a life mission to end harassment. Why go through a path that may be actually quite difficult?
As wild as this may sound, we really thought that we could make a difference. And I think that we have. I had experienced street harassment for years and years. And at the time, though, there was a young woman named Tal Nguyen who was riding the New York City subway when an older restaurateur exposed himself to her. And Tao had seen that happen before. And so she took his picture with her newfangled 2005 cell phone camera and she took it to the police. And the police were like, sorry, miss, he's probably 7 or 8 stops away. Nothing we can do. So she put it on Flickr, the photo sharing website. It went viral. It made it to the cover of the New York Daily News here in New York City. And we were so inspired by Tao. We were like, what if we told our stories too? What if this wasn't just something that we put up with? And I think too, with that came with us being inspired long-term by folks like Anita Hill and the broader movement to address sexual harassment in the workplace. I think we were really standing on the shoulders of a lot of amazing women who had done something, and we wanted to be a part of that.
There's so much of this that is part of a societal issue, which is normalizing harassment to a certain extent. And I'd like to go deeper on that because it reflects in some of the polls and trainings results that we've had on sexual harassment, when we can summarize those polls into two different sides. One, that where people feel that harassment is overblown, that we've become too sensitive as a society, that normal interactions, the little weird moment or an awkwardness between two people, even jokes, are suddenly now labeled as harassment. So that's one part. And then there's the other side that argues that harassment is a real safety issue that destroys people's lives and careers. So what are your thoughts on this?
When it comes to this issue of harassment, is it just a bunch of hypersensitive women or hypersensitive people of color? The reality is that harassment, while it is certainly on the lower end of the spectrum of violence, it still is quite common, right? And so if you are experiencing harassment, like many folks are across the world, when you walk out on the street, when you take the train to work, when you are walking through that parking lot, when you are entering the door to your job or to the school, right? And all of these intervals throughout your day, your week, your month, you're experiencing these low levels of harassment. It has this very real impact on your ability to function. You start to feel braced for it everywhere you go. Your core sense of safety, which is critical to you you being able to navigate the world and be successful in that is challenged. And I think that that's the piece that people forget. I think if harassment was just, a one-off, a small thing, it happened maybe once every couple years, people could and would likely move through that depending on how severe it was. But when it's happening all of the time, every day, when you're expecting it in every corner in which you exist, it starts to have a much more serious impact. And that impact can be just as severe as more extreme forms of violence like rape, right? We hear stories of people becoming suicidal or committing suicide as a result of these repeated instances of harassment. We hear stories of people, not taking jobs or not moving into certain neighborhoods or not, going out at night because of the fear of harassment. There's a lot of data that shows that hate and harassment in any forms has very serious health impacts on people, mental health impacts on people, financial impacts on people. But ultimately, I think it's a lot simpler than that. I think it's about the way that we treat people. How do we want to take care of each other? How do we want to show up for each other? Sometimes the label of harassment can feel like a heavy label, but ultimately, are you treating that person like you would want to be treated? I think is the core fundamental question there. And if you're not, why? And what needs to happen to get you there?
Because the work at WHO, actually, it makes me think, because of our work at WHO has started with sexual harassment, I think it's worth us making a distinction between harassment and sexual harassment. Mm-hmm. What's the difference and how do we draw that line between these two?
Yes. What's interesting is that I think the word harassment itself really emerges out of the movement to address sexual harassment. When we talk about racialized forms of harassment or harassment against religious minorities, for example, we tend to use words like microaggressions or hate. I think sexual harassment is really focused on demeaning somebody because they are a woman or because they're gender broadly. And it's focused on comments about their appearance or that kind of thing. Whereas other forms of harassment are focused on other parts of their identity, right? It's focused on race or it's focused on, socioeconomic status, for example. I think what's interesting about this is that in some ways, it's a useful division, but in other ways, oftentimes you don't know why you are experiencing harassment. And even if it's very clearly sexual harassment, if it's very clearly somebody acting inappropriately toward you in that way, chances are you're much more likely to experience that sexual harassment if you're a woman of color or if you have a disability than you would be otherwise, right? And so all of these pieces kind of compound into the experience of harassment, whether or not they are sexual in nature.
So let's zoom in the workplace, where most companies have a zero tolerance policy, including WHO. But does that actually create safer environment? Is just having a policy enough?
A policy in and of itself is never going to be enough. It's how you implement that policy that matters. I think that what a policy does do is it sends a message that your organization cares. And that is critically important, but you can't just bury it in a policy manual. You've got to really live out that message in your organizational values. You've got to live out that message in terms of how all the other policies, right, intersect with it. You've got to live out that message in making sure that, when folks are harassed, which is frankly somewhat inevitable in today's time in a modern workplace, that they're taken care of, right? That the folks who harass them are getting the feedback or the consequences necessary to not do that thing again. You want to make sure that folks are trained. I think in particular, one of the places where we've seen a lot of hope. And hope is important when it comes to hate and harassment, because most people think that the only thing that they can do to stop hate and harassment is to not hate or harass. But where we're seeing a lot of hope is in training bystanders to intervene when it happens. And particularly, I think it's effective in a workplace when you see those low levels of disrespect happening, when it's not even at the point of anything that would remotely look like a legal definition of harassment. When you're just talking about people cutting each other off or rolling their eyes at each other, or refusing to say good morning to somebody, right? That type of disrespect in the workplace, we can get at that as everyday employees pretty easily through bystander intervention. We can disrupt that and work to create a more healthy workplace. And that's something that you don't need to be in leadership. You don't need to be in management to do. And what we've seen is that not only is it shifting that culture, it's also making people feel a lot safer at work. And when you feel safe at work, that is fundamental to you doing your best work.
So when you say bystander, we mean?
So bystander just means somebody who is witnessing the hate, the harassment, the microaggression, the disrespect, right? You're not experiencing it yourself. You just see it happening and you don't know what to do most of the time. And so we teach folks what to do when they witness hate or harassment happening, whether it's things like creating a distraction, delegate, finding somebody else to help, documenting the incident, delaying and waiting until the incident's over and then checking in on that person, or directly intervening in it and saying something about it, right? These are all things that, everyday bystanders can do and everyday people can do to take care of each other.
So I am in the office. I witness my friend Joe, who has this colleague that comes to her a bit too close, and I can see that she's physically uncomfortable. But I don't know if I'm reading too much into it, and everyone's smiling, so it doesn't seem like there is misunderstanding or tension or there's anger, or it doesn't look like a negative emotions, but that looks some discomfort, but it's not clear. I can't tell you exactly what it is. I just sense this. Because I'm not really sure, and I might be reading between the lines, or I'm maybe not, I don't want to create a problem that is not there. I decide not to intervene, or I decide to stay silent. What advice would you give me?
I mean, the reality is two things. First of all, you're very rarely going to be 100% sure that this is disrespect or harassment unless the person experiencing it is flagging you down and telling you that, right? The other thing is that when you choose an indirect form of intervention, like distract, delegate, document, delay, right? None of those things are going to create harm in that situation. So, what I might do in that situation is just call that person over, the person who is being sort of having their personal space invaded. Just call them over closer to me, give them an excuse to step out of that dynamic, and then just quickly check in on them. Or like, are you okay? And they could be like, yeah, I am okay. Like, that was no big deal. So and so is like my friend, whatever. But still, the chances are for that woman in that situation, chances are, even if she wasn't experiencing any form of discomfort, harassment in that moment, she has before, and she's going to be grateful that you in this moment took a chance and took a risk to take care of her, right? That's huge. And on this flip side of the coin, to the person who was doing that to her, they are none the wiser, right? Like, all they know is that their friend or whoever, their coworker, stepped away, and now they're back, right? So, I think these are things that we can do that are really low risk. And I'm going to tell you, as somebody who is naturally a little conflict averse, is somebody who is a woman and is also scared of experiencing the harassment turn on me. That is why, we love bystander intervention so much, is because it is so low risk, right? It really is just taking care of people, and there's low consequences all around, right? The culture is able to shift, and people are able to be taken care of without any kind of extreme punishment or dramatic grandstanding.
I find what you're saying is very useful, because between women, especially if we are close, this is something we naturally do it's like, oh, I think there's something going on. So you just distract, and you either come in, join the conversation so that there's a witness, but I think for men who hear this podcast, is if they can see it and they're not sure if to intervene, I think it's actually a good thing. And whoever's being where their space is being invaded will appreciate the diffusion. I think it's a great advice for even men who don't feel like it's their place, or maybe it's not warranted.
You're right. I think it's good. It's good for everyone, right? Because men are going to be no more sure that is sexual harassment that's happening, or that woman is potentially uncomfortable, than anybody else would be. And they don't need to come in and be like, excuse me, right? You're standing too close to her. Because that can also, be read as like a male savior dynamic, right? Whereas if you're very subtle, you're not trying to be detected, you're truly just trying to make sure that your friend is being taken care of. It's low risk, and it also really prioritizes that person and the voice of the person who may be experiencing this and their own perception of what's happening in the dynamic.
And if we go to raise awareness on what a zero tolerance policy is. And I was speaking to this Harvard professor who on the podcast mentioned that trainings do not really help move the needle in general. What are your thoughts on this?
I think training is part of a package of things that's going to move the needle. A policy is not going to move the needle by itself, but it's helpful. A training is not going to move the needle by itself, but it's helpful, right? There's no easy, one solution answer to these issues. These are heavily entrenched issues in our society, in our culture. You're not going to solve sexism globally with one organizational training. Like, let's be real about that.
I want to tackle the fact that there's a lack of enforcement. When we had this prep call, you mentioned that the US also makes a distinction in terms of enforcement on ensuring that organizations are taking their duty of care in making sure that the employees don't get harassed. Mm-hmm. It seems that the legislation doesn't necessarily doesn't put harassment at the same level of importance than sexual harassment. Is that correct?
Yeah, it is. If you want to be able to make a case around sexual harassment, typically you can report one incident of sexual harassment, especially if it's quid pro quo sexual harassment. So I will give you this promotion if you, do this sexual favor for me type harassment. You only need a one-off. Whereas if you are going to prove racialized forms of harassment in the workplace, oftentimes you're looking at proving a hostile work environment, and you need many, many, many more examples than just that one. I think that what is unfortunate is that a lot of the legislation that exists, at least in the United States, that addresses sexual harassment has not been more inclusive of other forms of harassment. We have in the United States mandated sexual harassment trainings in most states, and they're not mandated to talk about racialized harassment or homophobic harassment or any other type of harassment in those trainings, any other protected class. And speaking about sexual harassment as just sexual harassment really obscures the problem to some extent, because it rarely is just sexual harassment. Typically, that person is also experiencing harassment based on some other component of their identity as well. And so I think that if we're going to do it right, we need to look at all forms of hate and harassment holistically, not just peel them off one type at a time.
What about accountability at a corporate level? And if you're an employer, where does your accountability begins and ends?
In the United States, there's a lot of really strict rules around manager accountability when it comes to harassment. Essentially, if you are witnessing it, you absolutely have to report it and move on it. If you're even aware of it, you absolutely have to report it and move on it. And I would say that that's a good baseline, right? Is that you need to address it in some way, shape, or form. What that is going to look like could be a lot of things. I think that it could look like partnering with your HR team. It could look like a very direct conversation during the fact or after the fact. I will say that for managers, there is an increased pressure and importance in addressing it in a group dynamic if it's happening in a group dynamic. So if there is some form of disrespect or harassment that's happening in a meeting, you're going to want to norm set around that, right? You're going to want to say, like, this isn't how we are going to treat each other here, or this isn't acceptable, right? You don't just want to pull that person aside and have a one-on-one with them. You really want to norm set for the culture. As a manager, right, if in the moment you are flustered and you don't really know what's going on and you're not sure if you saw it right, then the move would be to do a little bit more investigation, lean in with curiosity, and then come back to the group dynamic and set that norm for folks. But norm setting I think is a really important and critical role for your management team. It's not just about addressing these things, right? It's about making sure that folks know that they shouldn't expect this if they're working here.
What makes it feels like everything around harassment changes only if there's some rule or some law or some enforcement why is that? Why do we need this to have a culture that is harassment free or strive towards that?
That's the $1 million question, isn't it? I mean, I'm gonna put out a wild idea, which is that I don't know the extent to which I think all these rules and laws are important. I don't think they're a replacement for people just treating each other like human, right? Why do we need a law to treat each other like humans? Why do we need a law to take care of each other? It's our core basic part of our humanity. I think it is the definition of humanity, is that desire to take care of each other, right? And in a core and fundamental way. The reality is there's going to be folks who are breaking that very human contract. And I think it's on the rest of us, of which I want to say is most of us, right? I want to say, 99% of people, 99% of the time, are working their hardest to create a world that's good for all of us. And sometimes we just got to be a little louder. And that's annoying because we didn't create the harassment. We didn't do the harassment. But it's better than just depending on the people experiencing the harassment to handle it alone.
And to kind of close off our conversation, I know that we start off with your mission to end all forms of harassment. And this has been, I think, a 20-year journey so far.
Yeah.
How far have we come? And this is not a reflection of just your work. I think there's a whole movement that have been doing this. But how far have we come? And how much more do we have to go? What's the ideal society we're looking at?
You know what? Spending the past 20 years of my life, which is, the vast majority, if not all of my professional career, addressing harassment has been the most tremendous and hopeful gift. Yes, it is still happening, right? But in the past 20 years, we have decided, many of us as a society, as a culture, that it's not okay. You know, when I started this work, the only form of harassment that we collectively thought might not be okay is basically the sexual harassment of cisgendered white women in the workplace. And that was it, right? Everyone else was left to their own devices. Even when we started Right to Be, the term street harassment existed. It was coined by an academic in the 1980s, but nobody knew what it was. Now we have the world's largest makeup brand globally championing this issue of street harassment because data showed time and time again this was the number one issue facing women globally. And as the number one makeup brand, they wanted to address it. And so that's 20 years. Okay, we're not talking about decades and decades and decades. And I think sometimes we can get down on ourselves for being like, oh, it's not going to change in my lifetime. You know, I realize that right now we are in a massive global retrenchment on all the progress that we have made over the past 20 years, but it's a blip. Right? It's, you know, the last gasp of white supremacy and patriarchy and whatever else. And then we're going to get right back to it, right? We're going to get right back to this work of taking care of each other in a meaningful way. And I have a lot of hope. And I think that if this past 20 years is any indicator, we are in a really great place. I do want to say, however, we have got to get out of these silos of just addressing sexual harassment or just addressing, you know, ableist forms of harassment or, you know, just address whatever it is, right? I think people, no matter where you live in the world, no matter what your political orientation is care, right? We got to take care of each other. That's it. It's that simple, right? It's not about, you know, being woke. It's not about being politically correct. It's not about the political spectrum fueling violence, right? It is truly just about how we take care of each other. And I think if we can get there, right, then that's what's going to fuel the progress for the next 20.
And I think that message really resonates, especially for the aid sector, when one of our, you know, main mantras is our duty of care and do no harm. So I think you're speaking to the right audience here. And thank you so much, Emily, for your mission and for not giving up, because it is really a difficult path. And we really, I think, are grateful for people who continue and make sure that this is something that gets addressed.
Thank you so much, Guni. Such a pleasure.
Thank you for listening. If you have any feedback or questions, feel free to reach out to us to prsEAH@who.int. Until the next time, goodbye.